What if the ancient world's most dangerous artifacts weren't treasures at all, but curses? Buried under sand and locked behind museum glass, some warnings still feel alive, carved by scribes who meant their threats to outlast empires. These weren't stories, they were systems, tools of fear, control, and supernatural punishment that shaped entire civilizations. Tonight, we uncover 30 ancient curses still believed to hold power today. Welcome to the 30 most dangerous ancient curses still active today. If you crave dark documented history, you're in the right place. Valley of the Kings, November 26, 1922. The sun hangs low over limestone cliffs that glow like burnished copper in the afternoon heat. Howard Carter kneels in the dust, hands trembling as he enlarges a hole in the sealed doorway that has remained intact for over 3 millennia. Behind him, Lord Carnarvon shifts his weight from foot to foot, mopping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that will be soaked through before the sun sets. The air tastes stale and heavy, saturated with dust that hasn't stirred since the New Kingdom collapsed in political chaos and foreign invasion. As Carter peers through the hole by candlelight, the flame flickers in currents of air that seem to breathe from the tomb itself. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asks, his voice tight with anticipation, and something else, a growing unease that he can't quite name. Carter's famous response, "Yes, wonderful things," would echo through archaeological history. But what he didn't say in that moment, what he wrote in his private journal that night, was that the wonderful things seemed to be watching him back. The official narrative that emerged over the following decades: simple, clean, convenient. There is no curse. The deaths were media exaggeration. Early fatalities were nothing more than coincidence mixed with tropical disease and the natural hazards of early 20th century Egypt, where sanitation was poor and medical care limited. The British Museum, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, and academic institutions worldwide have been repeating this official line for a century. But Howard Carter's private diary, archived at the Griffith Institute at Oxford and only partially published, tells a profoundly different story. Between 1923 and 1930, 22 people directly connected to the tomb's opening died under circumstances that defied statistical probability. These weren't random tourists or distant acquaintances. These were core team members, financial backers, and family members who had direct physical contact with the burial chamber and its contents. Lord Carnarvon himself, dead within 5 months of the tomb opening, struck down by what doctors officially called septicemia from an infected mosquito bite that he accidentally nicked while shaving. But nurses at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo reported that in his final delirium, Carnarvon spoke repeatedly about the boy king's anger and begged forgiveness for disturbing the eternal rest. His half-brother, Colonel Aubrey Herbert, died by apparent suicide just 1 day after the tomb was opened, leaving a note that mentioned divine retribution for sacrilege against the gods of Egypt. Arthur Mace, the archaeologist who actually wielded the tools that broke through the sealed door, died at the Continental Savoy Hotel shortly after Carnarvon from what medical records describe as a mysterious illness characterized by progressive weakness and delirium. Hotel staff reported that in his final days, Mace claimed something was following him through the corridors, and he refused to remain alone in his room after sunset. The team's photographer, Harry Burton, documented strange atmospheric disturbances that appeared in his photographs, but weren't visible to the naked eye. Luminous shapes that seemed to hover around certain artifacts, particularly those inscribed with hieroglyphs. Burton's technical notes, preserved in the Metropolitan Museum's archives, describe unusual photographic anomalies that he couldn't explain through conventional camera malfunction or film processing errors. Captain Richard Bethel, Carter's secretary and the man responsible for cataloging the tomb's contents, was found dead in his exclusive London Gentlemen's Club in 1929. The official cause, heart failure. But the club's night porter reported that Bethel had been seen in the early morning hours, wandering the library and muttering about names written in the Book of the Dead. His father, Lord Westbury, died by suicide the same year, reportedly unable to cope with what his son had told him about the psychological effects of extended exposure to the tomb's contents. Carter himself lived until 1939, but his health never fully recovered from his 7 years working in the tomb. Medical records from his London physician document the development of a persistent hand tremor that made detailed archaeological work increasingly difficult. More unsettling, Carter's letters to colleagues describe hearing voices in the tomb, corridors during the later stages of excavation, sounds like whispers in ancient Egyptian that stopped whenever he approached their source. His field notes contain references to workers fleeing the site repeatedly, claiming the dead pharaoh was watching them through the painted eyes on the burial chamber walls. Here's what they don't tell you in the museum plaques. Tutankhamun's tomb contained no explicit written curse inscription. Unlike other pharaonic burials, there was no clear textual warning to tomb violators. But it didn't need one. Egyptian mortuary theology was abundantly clear about divine retribution for tomb violation. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a living god whose body served as an anchor point between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Disturbing his eternal rest was more than grave robbery. It was an act of cosmic treason that would trigger automatic supernatural retaliation. Whether supernatural forces were actually at work, or whether the power of suggestion created a self-fulfilling prophecy, the pattern of clustered misfortune followed exactly what ancient Egyptian theology predicted would happen to oath-breakers and tomb robbers. 22 deaths, 5 suicides, multiple cases of progressive mental and physical deterioration, all within 7 years, all connected to a single sealed chamber that was supposed to contain nothing more dangerous than mummified organs, golden trinkets, and the preserved remains of a teenager who died over 3,000 years ago. And Tutankhamun wasn't the only ruler whose afterlife came with lethal consequences for those who dared disturb his eternal rest. Thunder rolls across the Anatolian plateau, and rain strikes the courtyards of Hattusa with the force of divine anger. The year is approximately 1320 BCE, and the Hittite Empire stretches from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt, held together by a complex network of treaties, tribute agreements, and religious obligations that bind vassal kingdoms to the great king through sacred oaths witnessed by gods of storm and war. In the royal archives, deep beneath the citadel, where scribes work by oil lamp, even during daylight hours, clay tablets stack like gravestones in precise rows. Each shelf contains hundreds of cuneiform documents recording the most systematic use of curses in ancient diplomacy, treaties that function as much as magical contracts as political agreements. The air smells of wet earth and burning cedar from the temple braziers, where priests maintain perpetual fires to honor the gods who witness every diplomatic promise and stand ready to enforce every spiritual threat. The Hittite Empire operated on a principle so simple it was revolutionary. Break a treaty, receive divine punishment in the form of devastating plague that would sweep through your kingdom until your bloodline was extinct and your cities lay empty under the sun. This wasn't metaphorical plague or symbolic divine anger. This was actual plague, documented, recorded, tracked across decades of royal correspondence that reads like medical case studies combined with legal proceedings and religious investigations. The official academic classification of these tablets, museum catalogs describe them as containing religious literature and mythic plague prayers, harmless cultural artifacts that provide insight into ancient beliefs about disease causation and divine intervention. Scholars treat them as windows into primitive understanding of epidemiology, nothing more than historical curiosities about how pre-scientific societies explained medical phenomena through supernatural causation. But tablet CTH 376, currently housed in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, records King Mursili II's desperate prayer to the storm god during a plague that devastated the Hittite Empire for over 20 years, killing hundreds of thousands and bringing the greatest military power of the Bronze Age to its knees. The text doesn't read like mythology or religious poetry. It reads like a forensic investigation conducted by a king, trying to understand why his people were dying by the thousands, using the curse language embedded in his own diplomatic documents as a diagnostic tool to identify the spiritual source of his kingdom's medical catastrophe. Because my father transgressed against the word of the storm god, the tablet records in Mursili's own voice, the storm god became angry with my father and gave plague to the Hittite land. This wasn't poetic metaphor. This was a king documenting his belief that specific treaty violations by his predecessor had triggered automatic, supernatural retaliation that manifested as epidemic disease. The tablet goes on to catalog various diplomatic agreements that might have been violated, analyzing each treaty's curse clauses like a lawyer reviewing contract terms to determine liability. Hittite treaty tablets follow a precise legal and religious formula that remained consistent across centuries. Historical preamble establishing the relationship between the parties, specific terms outlining obligations and privileges, a list of witness gods who observed the agreement, and detailed curse clauses that specify exact supernatural punishments for specific violations. The curses aren't decorative elements added for dramatic effect. They're enforcement mechanisms designed to operate automatically when treaty terms are violated, creating divine surveillance and supernatural prosecution systems that function independently of human law enforcement. If the king of this land transgresses these words, reads a typical curse clause, let these oath gods destroy the king together with his person, his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, his land, and his possessions. Then comes what archaeologists call the plague catalog, systematic lists of specific disasters that will befall treaty violators, consumption that wastes the body, fever that burns the mind, famine that empties the granaries, earthquakes that topple the palaces, enemy invasions that scatter the armies like dust before wind. In the archives of Hattusa, Mursili II documented multiple investigations into broken oaths that coincided with disease outbreaks across his empire. When plague struck the capital, he consulted treaty records to identify which diplomatic promise might have been violated, which sacred oath might have triggered divine anger. When his stepmother was accused of practicing sorcery against him, she was investigated specifically for curse-making activities that could have turned friendly deities into enemies, transforming protective divine forces into agents of supernatural persecution. Picture the king pacing the temple courtyards at dawn, his sandaled feet echoing against stone as he watches priests burn offerings designed to appease the storm god's wrath. Around him, the complex bureaucracy of the empire continued its increasingly desperate work. Scribes recording daily death tolls from plague-stricken cities, military commanders reporting decimated units unable to maintain frontier garrisons, ambassadors drafting careful explanations to foreign powers about why tribute payments would be delayed due to divine discipline for unspecified treaty violations. For 20 years, this continued. 20 years of plague documented in multiple tablet series stored in different archives, cross-referenced and verified through diplomatic correspondence with kingdoms across the ancient Near East. The disease patterns were linked by the king himself to broken curse formulas embedded in diplomatic documents, creating a paper trail that connected supernatural enforcement theory with observed medical catastrophe. The Hittites built their entire foreign policy around the assumption that treaty violations would trigger divine surveillance systems that operated through epidemic disease, economic collapse, and military defeat. Whether the gods were actually listening, or whether fear of cursed tablets created psychological conditions that weakened kingdoms and made them vulnerable to natural disasters, the system worked with terrifying efficiency. Fear of supernatural retaliation kept smaller kingdoms loyal to Hittite authority for centuries, and when the empire finally collapsed, it wasn't due to treaty violations. It was because the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean world collapsed simultaneously, suggesting that even the gods had limits. But it wasn't just nations that lived under divine threat. Individuals had their lives and their land bound to the same kind of supernatural terror, enforced through boundary markers that turned property ownership into a form of spiritual warfare. In the dimmed halls of the British Museum, a black stone Kuduru boundary marker sits under spotlights, carved with symbols that seem to absorb rather than reflect light. Scorpion, snake, curved blade, divine emblems watching over property lines that have been dust for millennia. Museum placards describe these as boundary stones with religious ornamentation, legal artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia marking land grants with decorative divine imagery. The inscriptions tell a different story. These aren't decorations. They're supernatural security systems. Each Kuduru protected its land grant with a catalog of specific torments for anyone who dared alter the boundaries. blindness, madness, childlessness, death by enemy action, death by wild beasts, death by judicial execution, death by divine fire from heaven. Kuduru stones from the Kassite period contain some of the most detailed curse language ever carved. The boundary marker of Nebuchadnezzar. Im threatens violators with having their name and seed destroyed, their descendants cut off, and their flesh eaten by dogs in the street. The stone specifies that the curse will pursue not just the violator, but their children, their children's children, and their entire lineage until it is wiped from the face of the earth. These weren't idle threats carved by paranoid farmers. The Kuduru system was royal policy. Kings issued land grants with built-in supernatural enforcement because legal enforcement was difficult across a vast empire. Local governors might be corrupt, military patrols were sparse, but divine retribution was immediate, absolute, and required no bureaucracy. Archaeologists have found Kuduru stones carefully buried at property corners, positioned so the curse inscriptions face outward toward potential trespassers. The stones were legal documents, but they were also magical weapons. Property titles backed by divine violence. The landowner who commissioned a Kuduru knew exactly what he was purchasing, a piece of land protected by a catalog of divine sanctions that would destroy anyone who moved his boundary markers, altered his grant, or transferred his property without authorization. When he ran his fingers over the carved curse formulas, he was touching what amounted to a supernatural contract with the gods of judgment. Ancient Mesopotamian legal texts record court cases involving Kuduru violations. In several instances, illness or death among family members was cited as evidence that someone had interfered with protected land. The curse functioned as both deterrent and legal evidence. If your neighbor's children started dying after you moved a boundary stone, the curse inscription could be introduced in court as proof of divine judgment. Property protection through systematic cursing. Contract law reinforced by divine terror. Land grants that came with built-in spiritual weaponry. And land wasn't the only thing protected by divine violence. Sometimes whole enemies were reduced to objects just so they could be broken. Dawn breaks over a temple courtyard in the ancient Thebes. Clay figurines of named enemies stand in a line, painted red like dried blood, each one inscribed with the name of a foreign ruler, a rebellious official, or a rival city. The priest's hands move methodically as he smashes each figure with a stone mallet, muttering curses as clay dust coats his fingers. This is execration magic, ritualized annihilation. Your name written on clay, your image broken, your essence buried beneath the foundations of Egyptian cities. The official archaeological interpretation, symbolic rituals, and psychological warfare. Ancient Egyptians engaging in harmless religious theater to boost morale during conflicts. But the Berlin and Brussels execration texts contain the actual names of real foreign rulers, specific enemy cities, and identifiable political rivals from the Middle Kingdom period. These weren't generic symbolic figures. They were targeted spiritual assassinations. The execration process followed a precise ritual formula. Scribes inscribed clay figures with the names of Egypt's enemies, often including personal details, family members, titles, political alliances. Red pigment was applied to simulate blood. The figures were then ceremonially broken, while priests recited specific curses calling on Egyptian gods to cause the death of the named individuals, to destroy their houses, to eliminate their seed from the earth. The broken pieces were buried beneath temple foundations, at city gates, or at the borders of Egyptian territory. Archaeological excavations at Mergisa Fortress in Nubia uncovered hundreds of shattered execration figures buried in foundation deposits, their fragments mixed with animal bones and ritual pottery. The Munich execration texts include curses against specific Nubian chiefs who were actively rebelling against Egyptian rule. Some of the names match those found in Egyptian military records from the same period. When the curses were performed, these were real people leading real armies against Egyptian interests. More unsettling, several of the foreign rulers named in execration texts died or disappeared from historical records shortly after the Egyptian curse rituals were performed. The Prince of Ashkelon, named in one Berlin text, vanished from diplomatic correspondence after Egyptian priests broke his clay effigy. the chief of Kenti Min, cursed in multiple figurines, died in a hunting accident according to Egyptian intelligence reports. Coincidence? Possibly. But Egyptian military records suggest that execration rituals were often coordinated with espionage and assassination campaigns. Breaking the clay figure was the supernatural component of a broader strategy to eliminate political threats through both magical and practical means. The priest finishing his dawn ritual would wash the clay dust from his hands and file a report with the temple administration. Enemies cursed, figures broken, fragments buried. Another day's work in the bureaucracy of divine violence. But some of the most dangerous curses weren't written on objects at all. They were baked quietly into the rules of democracy itself. The Athenian agora at dawn. Citizens gather with pottery shards in their hands, scratching names onto broken bits of ceramic with metal styluses. The clatter of ostraca fills the morning air as democracy prepares to destroy someone's life. Ostracism is presented in history textbooks as a peaceful democratic safety valve, a way for citizens to remove potentially dangerous leaders without violence or bloodshed. 10 years of exile, then return to the city as if nothing happened. The surviving ostraca tell a darker story. Over 11,000 pottery shards from ostracism votes have been recovered from the Athenian agora. Many contain more than names, they contain curses. May Themistocles perish miserably. Let Aristides die childless. May Cimon never return from exile. These aren't votes, they're spiritual attacks using the machinery of democratic process. The language on some ostraca suggests coordinated campaigns that went far beyond political preference. Identical handwriting appears on multiple shards with the same candidate's name, indicating organized attempts to stuff the ballot. More disturbing, some shards contain curse formulas borrowed from deficciones, lead curse tablets, showing that citizens were using democratic procedures to perform binding magic against their targets. Archaeological analysis of ostraca from the 480s BCE reveals that the campaign against Aristides the Just involved not just political opposition, but systematic character assassination using supernatural language. Shards call for his family line to be cut off and his name forgotten forever. Standard curse terminology for complete spiritual destruction. The man whose name appeared on the most pottery shards wasn't just voted out of office. He was ritually expelled from the community. His property was seized. His political alliances were severed. His supporters faced social ostracism by association. For 10 years, his name could not be spoken in the assembly without risking legal charges for recalling in exile. When Aristides returned from exile in 480 BCE, witnesses reported that he moved through Athens like a ghost. Former friends refused to acknowledge him in public. His political career was finished. He died in poverty, despite his previous wealth and influence. The ostracism process had worked exactly as designed. Complete social death, followed by physical marginalization until natural death. The system was praised as democracy in action, but functionally, it was institutionalized cursing, a way for the demos to collectively channel supernatural violence against individual citizens using religious language and ritual procedures. The pottery shards weren't ballots. They were thousands of small curse tablets activated through majority vote. Citizens didn't just participate in democracy, they participated in ritualized destruction of their neighbors using divine authority. The vote was the spell. The majority was the priesthood. The result was a person, erased. By now the pattern is clear. Call it law, religion, or politics. Every system in the ancient world had a dark enforcement mechanism built in. And it was just beginning. Deep beneath the British Museum's public galleries, in climate-controlled storage that few visitors ever see, clay tablets stack like ancient gravestones. Among them, fragments of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that contains perhaps the most dangerous curse concept ever recorded, the Tablet of Destinies. Museum descriptions classify this as pure mythology and cosmic symbolism, ancient literary material with no practical applications. But Mesopotamian kings performed real rituals to safeguard destiny objects that determine cosmic order. The Tablet of Destinies wasn't just a story element. It was a theoretical weapon so dangerous that even possessing it incorrectly could trigger universal chaos. According to the Anzu myth, whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies controls fate itself, but the possession must be legitimate, authorized by divine hierarchy. Theft of the tablet doesn't grant power. It unleashes cosmic disorder that destroys the thief and everything connected to them. The curse is built into unauthorized access itself. Babylonian administrative texts record elaborate security protocols around royal regalia and divine symbols that parallel the mythological protections around the Tablet of Destinies. Certain objects could only be touched by specific priests during specific ceremonies. Wrong person, wrong time, wrong intention, and divine violence followed automatically. The high priest placing the tablet in its sealed chest wasn't just performing a storage procedure, he was activating a supernatural security system. The curse inscriptions warned that unauthorized handling would result in erasure from the Book of Life, destruction of name and memory, and darkness covering the transgressor's path forever. King Sennacherib's annals describe his destruction of Babylon in 689 BCE as divine punishment for the city's violation of sacred protocols. When Babylonian priests tried to use captured Assyrian royal regalia in their own ceremonies, Sennacherib interpreted this as theft of destiny objects that triggered automatic curse retaliation. The entire city was flooded and abandoned for 8 years. Even if you call it myth, it's still a recorded belief that power is so dangerous it needs a curse to protect it. The Babylonian political system operated on the assumption that certain forms of authority were protected by immediate supernatural violence against unauthorized users. Modern museum curators handling Mesopotamian destiny objects report unusual accidents, equipment malfunctions during exhibitions, unexplained illness clusters among conservation staff, repeated security system failures in galleries containing royal regalia. The British Museum's Mesopotamian collection has been reorganized 4 times in the last decade due to what administrative records call persistent technical difficulties. The curse doesn't require belief in magic. It requires understanding that some symbols carry so much accumulated cultural power that mishandling them has psychological and social consequences that feel like supernatural retaliation, ancient and modern, mythological and bureaucratic. The pattern continues, and sometimes the curse doesn't stay in a story. It comes preserved with the body. Alpine silence. 19th of September, 1991. Helicopter rotors echo off glacier walls as rescue teams extract a body from the ice, preserved for over 5,000 years, complete with Copper Age clothing, tools, and what appears to be a violent death. Ötzi the Iceman becomes an archaeological sensation. Museums fight for exhibition rights. Scientists queue for research access. Media coverage spans the globe. Everyone wants proximity to this impossible discovery. A window into Neolithic life, perfectly preserved. The official line on the Ötzi curse is straightforward. Media sensationalism. Dangerous alpine terrain. Coincidental deaths exaggerated by tabloid journalism seeking supernatural angles. But the documentation tells a different story. Helmut Simon, the German tourist who discovered the body, died in 2004 during a hiking accident in the same mountain region. An experienced climber who knew the terrain intimately, found dead after a fall that fellow mountaineers described as completely uncharacteristic for someone of his skill level. Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who led the initial examination, died in 2005 from complications related to multiple sclerosis that developed rapidly after his work with the body. In interviews before his death, Spindler admitted he had begun taking the curse seriously, noting that he was the one who had the most contact with the Iceman. Dieter Warnecke, the mountaineer who led the team to recover the body, died of a heart attack in 2005 at age 45. No previous cardiac history. Kurt Fritz, who assisted in the body's extraction, died in an avalanche in 2006. Rainer Herlitz, who filmed the discovery, died from a brain tumor in 2004. Helmut Simon's wife reported that her husband had become obsessed with returning to the discovery site in the months before his death, as if something was calling him back. Tom Loy, the scientist who discovered human DNA on Ötzi's arrowhead, died in 2005 from a rare blood disease that developed suddenly while he was writing a book about his research. His final interviews described recurring dreams about the Iceman watching him during laboratory work. 7 deaths, all among people directly involved with the discovery, removal, or scientific analysis of the body, all within 14 years, all unexpected. Accidents, sudden illness, or rapid disease progression. Ötzi himself died violently, an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, suggesting he was murdered. Copper Age European societies practiced ritual curses on the unburied dead, especially those who died through violence or betrayal. Disturbing such a body without proper spiritual protocol could trigger what anthropologists call pollution curses, contamination of the living by unresolved death. Whether supernatural or psychological, the pattern echoes ancient burial curse logic. Disturb the violently dead, inherit their misfortune. But if you really want to see how curses became paperwork, we need to go back to Rome. A smoky tavern in Roman Britain, somewhere near Hadrian's Wall, where soldiers and merchants gather to drink wine that tastes of resin and complain about the eternal rain. Lamplight flickers across rough wooden tables, scarred by decades of knives and coins, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with malevolent purpose. In the corner, hunched over a sheet of thin lead like a man writing his own death sentence, a shopkeeper scratches letters with a bronze stylus, his knuckles white with the pressure of his grip. His hands shake, not with cold, though the British winter seeps through stone walls like an unwelcome spirit, but with rage so pure it has crystallized into something approaching religious fervor. With each stroke of the stylus, he whispers the name of the man who stole his money, investing every syllable with the accumulated bitterness of months spent watching his business collapse while the thief prospered. The lead is soft, yielding to his stylus like flesh yielding to a blade, and he can feel the metal warming under his fingers as if the curse is already beginning to work. This is how curses became mass production in the Roman world. How supernatural violence transformed from the exclusive privilege of priests and kings into a cottage industry accessible to anyone with a few coins and enough hatred to justify divine intervention. How revenge became a service you could purchase at any temple, shrine, or sacred spring throughout the empire, as routine as buying bread or olive oil. Modern archaeologists and historians classify deficciones as private superstition and emotional venting, harmless religious theater for people unable to access proper legal remedies. Academic papers describe them as windows into the psychological coping mechanisms of ordinary Romans dealing with theft, betrayal, and social injustice. Museums display them as curiosities that demonstrate ancient beliefs about magic and divine intervention, treating them like primitive prototypes of modern therapy. But over 500 lead curse tablets have been recovered from Roman sites across Europe, Africa, and Britain, representing the largest surviving body of personal religious documents from the ancient world. These aren't random emotional outbursts, scrawled in moments of anger. They're systematic spiritual weaponry following standardized formulas that were taught by professional curse writers to clients seeking supernatural retaliation against specific enemies for specific offenses. The tablets follow precise ritual protocols that remained remarkably consistent across the empire. Names of targets were inscribed on thin lead sheets using established formulaic language, often including detailed personal information designed to ensure accurate divine targeting. Family members' names, professions, physical descriptions, addresses, daily routines. Specific injuries were requested in language that reads like medieval legal documents. May Marcus Tullius Cicero be unable to speak in court until he returns my stolen property. Let Gaius Appius's horses stumble during the race, bringing shame and financial ruin to his household. Cause Lucia Prima's customers to desert her shop and seek other vendors. The completed tablets were folded according to specific ritual requirements, pierced with iron nails to fix the curse in place, and deposited in carefully chosen locations, while the client recited binding formulas taught by religious specialists who understood the technical requirements for successful supernatural prosecution. Wells were favored because they provided direct access to underworld deities. Graves were used because the dead could serve as messengers to chthonic gods. Temple foundations were preferred because they placed the curse under divine protection, while the gods considered the case. The choice of lead wasn't accidental. Roman religious tradition associated the metal with Saturn, god of limitations, boundaries, and death, the deity most qualified to impose restrictions on enemies and enforce supernatural justice. The iron nails weren't decorative. They were ritual technology designed to fix magical intentions in place, preventing the target from escaping through counter-magic or religious protection. Bath's Temple of Sulis Minerva, where natural hot springs created a sacred space dedicated to healing and justice, contained over 300 curse tablets deposited by visitors seeking supernatural assistance with theft, legal disputes, and personal vendettas. These weren't tourists leaving prayers for good health. These were customers purchasing divine legal services from an underworld court system that operated parallel to Roman civil law. One tablet, translated from its original Latin, reads, "To the goddess Sulis Minerva, I give to your divinity and majesty my bathing tunic and cloak. Do not allow sleep or health to him who has done me wrong, whether man or woman, whether slave or free, unless he brings my property to your temple and makes satisfaction for his theft." The language is contractual, not emotional, a formal legal document transferring property to divine authority in exchange for supernatural prosecution services. These weren't metaphorical requests for divine guidance. They were contracts with underworld gods, requesting specific violence against named individuals in exchange for offerings and ritual observances. Roman legal texts record instances where curse tablets were introduced as evidence in court cases, suggesting that supernatural retaliation was considered a legitimate form of justice that complemented rather than replaced conventional legal proceedings. The most revealing statistic: at some Roman frontier sites, archaeologists have found more surviving curse tablets than surviving personal letters. People were writing more curses than they were writing to their families. Supernatural prosecution had become so routine that it left a larger archaeological footprint than ordinary. Correspondence. Workers at Bath's temple complex filled their days managing what amounted to a supernatural customer service operation. Priests accepted curse deposits, filed them in appropriate underground shrines according to the type of case and the deities involved, maintained records of active cases, and tracked results for clients who returned periodically to check on the progress of their spiritual lawsuits. The system worked so well that it spread throughout the empire, creating a standardized infrastructure for divine justice that operated independently of Roman civil courts while complementing official legal procedures. Citizens could pursue both conventional and supernatural remedies simultaneously, maximizing their chances of obtaining satisfaction from enemies who had wronged them. And while Rome perfected the mass production of personal curses through lead tablet technology, other kingdoms carved their threats directly into royal stone, creating permanent monuments to supernatural enforcement that would outlast the empires they were designed to protect. Black Sea cliffs under a full moon. Rock-cut chambers carved into limestone overlook waters that stretch toward the horizon, like polished obsidian. In the royal necropolis of Pontus, tomb entrances gape like mouths frozen mid-scream, their inscriptions still legible after 2 millennia. The academic consensus? Typical religious warnings, nothing unusual. Standard Hellenistic mortuary formulae with no special significance. But the inscriptions specify exact punishments for tomb violation with legal precision that suggests real enforcement expectations. Whosoever shall open this tomb or remove anything therein, let him find no rest in life. Let his children die before him. Let his name be forgotten forever. Let the gods above and below pursue him with torments. The Pontic royal house ruled the southern Black Sea from 281 to 63 BCS, controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia. Their tombs were military targets during Roman expansion, regularly looted by armies seeking royal treasure. But excavation records from early archaeological expeditions note unusual illness clusters among workers. The 1890 expedition led by French archaeologist Georges Perrault recorded multiple cases of fever and delirium among local laborers working in the royal chambers. The team's foreman, a local man named Dimitri Kostakis, reported workers fleeing the site after experiencing nightmares of dead kings. 3 workers died during the excavation season, an unusually high mortality rate for archaeological work in the region. Pharaohs' private journals describe his own declining health during the excavation. He developed chronic insomnia, reporting dreams of royal figures speaking in ancient Greek, despite his minimal knowledge of the language. His sketches of tomb inscriptions became increasingly erratic, and several pages of his field notes contain text in ancient Greek that he claimed to have written unconsciously during fever episodes. The Pontic tombs contain both royal burials and extensive curse inscriptions, calling on Hecate, goddess of crossroads and the underworld, to pursue violators in this life and the life to come. The curses were carved in both Greek and the local Pontic dialect, suggesting they were intended for both foreign invaders and local tomb robbers. Local folklore around the excavation site maintains that the Pontic kings were never properly appeased after Roman conquest destroyed their dynasty. Regional death records from the Ottoman period show elevated mortality rates near the royal necropolis compared to other coastal areas, a pattern that continued into the modern era. The foreman debating whether to continue excavation after 2 accidents in 1 week wasn't making a practical decision based on worker safety. He was calculating whether spiritual protection rituals might allow the work to continue, or whether the royal curses required abandoning the site entirely. Royalty plus divine curse remains a cross-cultural constant. Power in life, protection in death, violence against violators. But you don't need a royal tomb to ruin someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is a ritual and a label. Unclean. Mycenaean palace. Firelight dances across blood-spattered stone floors as priests perform purification rites that will take 3 days to complete. The air reeks of burning herbs and sacrificial blood. In the shadows, a displaced prince realizes that his political defeat is only the beginning. He has been branded spiritually toxic in the eyes of his people. The Curse of Atreus is taught in literature classes as Greek tragedy. Mythological storytelling. The house of Atreus eating its own children in an endless cycle of revenge and divine punishment. But linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos contain administrative records referencing ritual purification procedures after violent political transitions. What we call myth, the Mycenaeans called policy. The curse system was real bureaucracy disguised as divine drama. The curse operated through ritual pollution. When a royal house committed acts that violated divine order, kinslaying, oath-breaking, guest betrayal, the entire lineage became spiritually contaminated. This pollution spread to anyone who allied with them, fought for them, or shared their table. Political support became a contagious spiritual disease. Tablet PYTN 316 from Pylos. Records offerings made for the purification of the palace after what scholars interpret as a violent succession dispute. The offerings include 100 cattle, gold vessels, and consecrated textiles, resources equivalent to several months of palace revenue. This wasn't symbolic ceremony. It was crisis management. The curse functioned as a political weapon because it provided divine justification for abandoning previous loyalties. Military commanders could defect from cursed rulers by claiming they were protecting themselves from spiritual contamination. Allied kingdoms could break treaties by arguing that the cursed dynasty had become too dangerous to support. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean sites shows patterns of palace abandonment that correlate with textual evidence for dynastic curses. Tyrans was abandoned around 1200 BCE after what administrative tablets describe as pollution of the royal house. Pylos was burned and never rebuilt after linear B tablets record extensive purification ceremonies that apparently failed to cleanse the dynasty. The genius of the curse system was its self-fulfilling nature. Once a royal house was declared spiritually polluted, their isolation and decline proved the curse was working. Military defeats became evidence of divine anger. Economic problems demonstrated supernatural punishment. Political opposition transformed into religious necessity. A prince branded with ritual pollution wasn't just politically defeated, he was socially radioactive. Former allies avoided him to protect their own spiritual status. Servants fled to prevent contamination. Even family members might reject him if priests declared the curse hereditary. The tragedy of Atreus wasn't mythological fiction. It was political reality disguised as religious necessity. Curse as social death sentence. spiritual contamination as regime change technology. And if you wanted to destroy not just a man, but a city, you went somewhere very specific. Steam rises from geological fissures beneath Apollo's temple, carrying with it the intoxicating vapors that transform ordinary priestesses into divine mouthpieces. Laurel leaves burn in bronze braziers positioned around the sacred chamber, their aromatic smoke mixing with sulfurous gases that leak from deep earth fissures to create an atmosphere that seems to vibrate with supernatural presence. The Pythia sways over the chasm, her movements becoming increasingly erratic as geological vapors and ritual preparation combine to produce the altered consciousness that Greeks interpreted as divine possession. An envoy from a distant city-state waits in the shadowed corridor outside the inner sanctum, nervously fingering the silver and gold offerings that represent his city's desperate attempt to purchase divine favor. He's traveled for weeks across mountain passes and dangerous seas to reach this sacred site, carrying questions about war, plague, colonial expansion, and political alliance that could determine his homeland's survival or destruction. His face falls as the oracle speaks words that amount to a death sentence for his homeland, divine authorization for his enemies to pursue coordinated military and political action against his people. The Delphic oracle is remembered in popular culture and academic literature as a mystical institution providing cryptic prophecies and neutral spiritual guidance. Ancient Greece's holiest site, standing above political manipulation and earthly corruption. Modern interpretations emphasize the oracle's role as a religious sanctuary, where Greeks from across the Mediterranean world could seek divine wisdom about personal and civic concerns in an atmosphere of sacred neutrality. But the historical record, preserved in the works of Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, and other ancient historians, reveals something much darker and more systematic. A religious institution that routinely issued divine press releases calling for the destruction of specific cities, rulers, and political movements. The oracle functioned as a supernatural court system where political conflicts were transformed into religious judgments, backed by divine authority that transcended human law and international treaty obligations. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE with access to eyewitness accounts and official records, documents multiple instances where the Pythia declared systematic divine curses against specific city-states that had supposedly offended Apollo through religious negligence, political arrogance, or violation of sacred protocols. These weren't vague spiritual warnings about moral improvement. They were specific predictions of political collapse, military defeat, and social catastrophe targeting named communities for named offenses. When the Athenians consulted Delphi during the early stages of the Persian Wars, seeking divine guidance about whether to resist Xerxes' massive invasion force, the initial oracular response was catastrophically negative. Flee to the ends of the earth, miserable wretches. Fire and swift Ares, speeding an Assyrian chariot, shall bring you low. Many a fortress shall he destroy, not yours alone. The oracle predicted total destruction, complete defeat, and divine abandonment of Athens in language that would have justified immediate surrender or evacuation if taken seriously. The political implications were staggering. If Athens accepted the oracle's verdict as divine judgment, the city would have been abandoned without resistance, leaving Greece open to Persian conquest and fundamentally altering the course of Western civilization. Only through a second consultation, and what Herodotus describes as careful reinterpretation of ambiguous language, did the Athenians obtain a more encouraging prophecy that allowed them to pursue the naval strategy that ultimately defeated the Persian fleet at Salamis, more politically targeted, when Croesus of Lydia, the wealthiest ruler in the ancient world, consulted Delphi before attacking Persia. The oracle's response was deliberately crafted for maximum ambiguity. If you cross the river Halys, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus assumed this meant he would destroy the Persian Empire. Instead, it meant his own Lydian empire would be destroyed. Delphi had effectively issued a divine curse against Croesus's military campaign while maintaining plausible deniability about the oracle's intentions. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi during the late 1st century CE and had direct access to temple archives and oral traditions, recorded instances where the oracle issued what amounted to political death sentences disguised as religious guidance. Cities declared hateful to the gods faced immediate diplomatic isolation, as other Greek states avoided military alliances, trade relationships, and marriage connections with communities under divine curse. The oracle's pronouncements created self-fulfilling prophecies where divine disapproval became political reality through coordinated social and economic ostracism. Military expeditions declared opposed by Apollo struggled to recruit allies or mercenaries, since soldiers feared that divine opposition would manifest as battlefield disasters, equipment failures, or supernatural intervention favoring their enemies. Commercial ventures lost financing when traders and investors decided that supernatural disapproval represented unacceptable business risk. Political candidates found their careers destroyed when oracular pronouncements suggested they lacked divine support for public office. The oracle's curse pronouncements aligned suspiciously with the political and economic interests of Delphi's wealthy patrons and allied city-states. When Spartan gold filled the temple treasury, oracular responses consistently favored Spartan interests in conflicts with Athens, Thebes, and other rivals. When Athenian silver increased during periods of imperial prosperity, divine guidance shifted to support Athenian policy positions and military objectives. The gods' political preferences correlated remarkably well with donation patterns and alliance structures. Archaeological evidence from the Delphic treasury houses, small temple buildings where individual city-states stored their offerings and displayed their wealth, shows that cities under oracular curses typically reduced their offerings dramatically, while divinely favored communities increased their dedications. The curse system created powerful financial incentives for political compliance with Apollo's divine will, as interpreted by the Delphic priesthood. Imagine being your city's most trusted envoy, traveling hundreds of dangerous miles to consult the gods about critical military or diplomatic decisions that could determine your people's survival, and returning home with divine authorization for your enemies to destroy you. The oracle's words would be copied onto bronze tablets and circulated throughout the Greek world as official proof of divine displeasure, creating international legal justification for coordinated action against your city. The Pythia wasn't providing neutral religious guidance or mystical wisdom about personal spiritual development. She was issuing supernatural press releases that could trigger coordinated political and military action against targeted states, functioning as divine voice for very earthly political and economic interests. Religious authority weaponized for strategic influence, spiritual power deployed for territorial and commercial advantage. The system worked because Greek political culture accepted divine authority as superior to human law, international treaty obligations, and even basic survival instincts. A city under oracular curse couldn't simply ignore the divine verdict. Political legitimacy, military effectiveness, and economic viability all depended on maintaining good relationships with the gods whose favored Delphi claimed to represent and interpret. And while Greece listened for divine verdicts from its sacred mountain, another coastal civilization was developing even more systematic curse technology, carving supernatural enforcement systems into gold tablets that created international legal frameworks backed by divine authority from multiple pantheons working in coordination. Underground ritual chamber in the ancient port city of Ugarit. 7 oil lamps burn in bronze stands arranged in a precise circle, their flames casting shifting shadows on walls decorated with divine symbols. The air smells of burning cedar and myrrh as priests prepare to activate what may be history's first curse package, a coordinated supernatural attack involving multiple gods working in systematic concert. Academic classification, mythopoetic liturgy, religious poetry with symbolic significance but no practical application. But tablets from Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, contain detailed curse rituals that read like divine military operations manuals. These aren't symbolic ceremonies, they're systematic supernatural warfare protocols. Tablet KTU 1.169 describes a 7-god curse ritual targeting oathbreakers. Let Baal strike him with lightning, let Mot consume his life force, let Yam drown his ships, let Resheph send plague to his house, let Anat scatter his armies, let El curse his name forever, let Asherah make his women barren. Each deity contributes specialized destruction to ensure total elimination of the target. The The ritual required 7 days of continuous ceremony. Each day focused on invoking one god's specific form of retribution. Participants fasted, maintained ritual purity, and performed blood sacrifices while reciting standardized curse formulas that were passed down through generations of temple priests. Ugaritic administrative texts record multiple instances where 7 god curses were commissioned by royal patrons against foreign enemies. The curses weren't just religious ceremonies, they were diplomatic weapons. Treaties contained clauses specifying that violations would trigger 7 god retaliation protocols. The most detailed example comes from a treaty between Ugarit and a Hittite vassal state. The agreement includes specific language requiring both parties to perform 7 god curse rituals against any third party that attacks either kingdom. Mutual supernatural defense pact backed by coordinated divine violence. Archaeological evidence from Ugarit's destruction around 1200 BCE suggests that the city's enemies may have used similar multi-god curse systems. The site shows evidence of systematic destruction that scholars describe as unusually thorough. Every building burned, every text archive destroyed, every religious shrine desecrated. This looks less like military conquest and more like ritual elimination designed to prevent the city's spiritual revival. Local mythology claims that Ugarit was destroyed because its priests cursed too many neighboring kingdoms, eventually triggering coordinated supernatural retaliation from multiple pantheons working together. Historical evidence suggests the city was indeed involved in extensive curse-based diplomacy during its final decades, possibly creating enough spiritual enemies to justify coordinated military action by a religious coalition. Multi-god curse package. As enforcement tool, divine task force operations. Supernatural violence distributed across specialized deities for maximum efficiency. But if you want something more hands-on, how about using the dead themselves as your legal backup? The necropolis outside Alexandria stretches under the desert sun like a city of the dead. Archaeological teams pry open lead coffin lids, revealing not just mummified remains, but carefully staged curse scenarios, bound wax figurines, pierced bronze tablets, and inscriptions that transform burial containers into supernatural courtrooms where the dead serve as eternal witnesses and enforcers. Museum records classify these finds as magical thinking and grief rituals. Ancient Egyptians processing death through harmless religious symbolism. But excavation reports describe systematic curse installations that required significant resources, professional expertise, and detailed knowledge of supernatural legal procedures. These weren't emotional responses to death. They were commissioned spiritual weapons designed to operate indefinitely. Lead coffin A.M. adorned. Dan 924, 315 from the Greco-Roman Museum of Alexandria contains the mummified remains of a woman named Artemisia, alongside a collection of curse materials targeting her husband's business partner. Wax dolls pierced with bronze needles, inscribed with the partner's name, and specific requests for financial ruin, social disgrace, and death by wasting disease. The burial inscription reads, Artemisia, wronged in life, empowered in death, witness to oaths broken, guardian against theft. Let her shade pursue Demetrius the merchant until justice is satisfied. The curse binds the dead woman to serve as supernatural enforcement against someone who apparently cheated her family during her lifetime. More elaborate, coffin A.M. At Noite, 931-428 contains what archaeologists call a curse theater, a carefully arranged scene with multiple wax figures representing an entire family of enemies, positioned around the corpse as if the dead person is presiding over a trial. Each figure is labeled with names, accusations, and requested punishments. The deceased becomes an eternal judge in a supernatural court case. The technical expertise required for these installations suggests a professional class of necromantic specialists who understood both burial protocols and curse technology. The lead coffins aren't mass-produced. They're custom supernatural weapons designed for specific targets, commissioned by grieving families with both money and enemies. Archaeological records note that several Alexandrian coffin curses target individuals whose deaths are documented in contemporary historical sources. Demetrius the merchant, cursed in Artemisia's coffin, died of a wasting disease 3 years after her burial, according to papyrus records from the same period. Marcus Flavius Hieronymus, named in another coffin curse, lost his shipping business to bankruptcy and died in debtor's prison. Correlation, not causation, but pattern nonetheless. Imagine commissioning a burial specifically to weaponize someone's afterlife, paying professional curse writers to transform your loved one into an eternal supernatural prosecutor, using death as an opportunity to file legal complaints with underworld courts that will pursue your enemies indefinitely. Death as judicial instrument. The grave as law office. Burial as the ultimate long-term legal strategy. And in the desert city of Petra, they didn't just rely on the dead, they put the threat right on the front of the tomb. Petra at sunrise. Rose-red sandstone glows like heated metal as morning light strikes tomb facades carved directly into cliff faces. The silence is absolute, except for desert wind whistling through stone corridors. On the tomb fronts, inscriptions in Nabatean Aramaic promise divine violence against anyone who disturbs these resting places. Academic interpretation, religious formula, and decorative elements. Standard ancient Near Eastern mortuary traditions with no special significance. But Nabatean tomb inscriptions combine supernatural threats with secular penalties in a hybrid enforcement system that bridges magical and legal retaliation. The curses aren't just religious, they're legally binding contracts with economic teeth. Tomb inscription CIS-2 354 from the Jabal Qubtha necropolis reads, "Cursed be he who opens this tomb or buries anyone else in it except those for whom it was made. Let him be cursed by Dushara and Manotu and Allat before the god who dwells in Petra. And let there be upon him a fine of 1,000 Nabatean sila to our Lord the King." Two-tier protection, divine curse plus royal fine. Violate the tomb, face supernatural punishment and legal prosecution. The dead person's family gets spiritual revenge and financial compensation. The crown gets revenue from tomb violation penalties. The Nabatean legal system recognized tomb curses as enforceable contracts. Court documents from Petra reference tomb inscriptions as evidence in property disputes, suggesting that curse language had standing in secular courts. Families could sue for both monetary damages and ritual compensation if their tombs were disturbed. More complex, some Nabatean tombs contain renewable curse clauses. The family could pay priests to refresh the spiritual protection periodically, ensuring that divine enforcement remained active across generations. Tomb M 1965-4 contains evidence of curse renewals spanning over 200 years, with additional inscriptions added by descendant family members. Archaeological excavation records from early 20th century expeditions note unusual patterns around Nabatean tomb sites. Multiple expeditions abandoned work after equipment failures, worker illness, and what site reports describe as persistent technical difficulties. The 1929 British expedition to the Jabal Qubtha necropolis was terminated early after the team photographer died from sudden illness, and local workers refused to continue. Meta moment. Imagine if your family plot came preloaded with a built-in lawsuit and a smiting clause. Modern cemeteries provide physical security through fencing and guards. Ancient Petra provided spiritual security through coordinated divine and royal enforcement systems. The Nabateans created a supernatural insurance industry, tomb protection as a service, renewable annually, backed by divine authority and royal courts. Death planning that included both burial arrangements and enemy destruction protocols. Family visits to renew. Tomb curses became regular religious observances, like paying spiritual property taxes to maintain supernatural security systems. And in the Far East, that logic was carved not just on stone, but on bronze. Earth cracks open over a nobleman's grave in ancient Chu territory. Bronze vessels emerge from darkness, their surfaces green with oxidation, but their inscriptions still sharp after 25 centuries. Archaeologists brush soil from ritual ding cauldrons and discover not just burial goods, but supernatural security systems designed to protect the dead through clan-based divine enforcement. Western archaeological interpretation, ritual dedication inscriptions. ceremonial texts with religious significance but no practical enforcement expectations. But Chinese warring states' tomb curses operate through lineage-based spiritual networks that combine ancestor worship with judicial procedure. These aren't individual supernatural threats. They're clan-level enforcement mechanisms that mobilize entire spiritual bureaucracies against tomb violators. Bronze vessel MMA 23292.1 from a 4th century BCE tomb contains an inscription invoking 17 generations of ancestors against anyone who disturbs the burial. Should any person remove these sacred vessels or violate this resting place, let the spirits of our forebears pursue him through 3 generations. Let his harvests fail, let his sons die childless, let his name be struck from the genealogy of the living. The curse doesn't just threaten the violator, it threatens his descendants and targets his spiritual citizenship in the community. Being struck from the genealogy meant social death even for living family members, who would be excluded from clan ceremonies, marriage arrangements, and business partnerships. Chinese tomb curses were enforced by both spiritual and earthly clan courts. Families maintained detailed genealogical records that could be used to track curse violations across generations. If someone violated a tomb and later experienced crop failure or family deaths, the victim's descendants could present this as evidence in clan legal proceedings. More sophisticated, some Chinese tomb curses include chain reaction clauses that extend punishment to anyone who benefits from tomb violation, merchants who purchased stolen burial goods, officials who failed to prosecute tomb robbers, even laborers who assisted in unauthorized excavations could face inherited curse consequences that followed their bloodlines indefinitely. Qin legal documents reference tomb curses as admissible evidence in state courts, suggesting that supernatural enforcement had recognition within imperial legal systems. Tomb violation wasn't just spiritual crime, it was theft of clan property backed by divine authority. Archaeological reports from modern Chinese excavations note that traditional feng shui masters are regularly consulted before opening ancient tombs, especially those containing curse inscriptions. The practice continues because local communities maintain belief in ancestral enforcement systems that operate across historical periods. Burial violation as both legal crime and spiritual offense. Curses, embedded in social code where law and supernatural enforcement merge into unified community policing. The dead serving as eternal prosecutors in cases that never close, pursuing violators through bloodlines that span centuries. By now, we've crossed deserts, mountains, palaces, temples, and every single one had the same message. Break the boundary, pay the price. And the deeper archaeologists dug, the darker it got. Cave 4, near Qumran, dry desert air preserves parchment that crumbles at the touch, revealing community rules that read like supernatural legal contracts. The Essene sect didn't just withdraw from mainstream Judaism, they created an isolated society where membership came with built-in curse clauses that could destroy violators physically, spiritually, and socially. Academic classification, sectarian legal literature, religious community regulations with historical significance for understanding Second Temple Judaism. But the Community Rule, 1QS, and Damascus Document, CD, contain systematic curse protocols that functioned as internal policing mechanisms in a society where traditional law enforcement didn't exist. These weren't just religious guidelines, they were supernatural enforcement systems for covenant violations. The Community Rule specifies exact punishments for members who violate sectarian discipline. Whoever has murmured against the foundations of the community shall be expelled and shall not return. But whoever has murmured against his companion unjustly shall be punished for 6 months. The punishments escalate from temporary exclusion to permanent spiritual exile, depending on the severity of the violation. More severe, members who betray the truth or walk in the stubbornness of their hearts face systematic curse procedures outlined in the War Rule, 1QM. The entire community gathers to perform collective curses against the violator, calling on divine armies to pursue him with destroying judgments and cut him off from all living. The sectarians understood themselves as living under divine covenant, where violations triggered automatic supernatural retaliation. Community membership wasn't just religious affiliation. It was entry into a spiritual legal system where divine enforcement replaced secular courts. Archaeological evidence from Qumran suggests that the community practiced physical separation of cursed members. Certain burial areas contain isolated graves that may represent sectarians who died under community curse, buried apart from full members to prevent spiritual contamination of the main cemetery. The Damascus document records actual cases where community curses were activated against specific individuals. Some members experienced what the texts describe as divine punishment for covenant violations: illness, social isolation, economic ruin, family disasters. Whether supernatural or social, the community attributed these misfortunes to properly activated curse procedures. Modern scholars studying the Dead Sea Scrolls report unusual patterns during research projects. The University of Chicago Oriental Institute noted multiple instances of equipment failure, researcher illness, and administrative difficulties specifically during projects involving the community rule and war rule texts. Several graduate students working on curse-related scroll fragments changed dissertation topics after experiencing what they described as persistent personal difficulties. Spiritual law equals membership contract with deadly stakes. Curses as internal policing mechanism in tight-knit sect. Community covenant backed by divine enforcement systems that operated through collective ritual procedures. The Qumran community didn't just live by religious rules. They lived inside a supernatural legal system where spiritual and social violations triggered coordinated divine retaliation. But some curses weren't just social. They were physically lethal by design. The mausoleum of China's first emperor lies beneath an artificial mountain near Xi'an, a geometric pyramid of earth and stone that rises 200 feet above the Wei River Valley like a monument to paranoia made manifest. For over 2 millennia, this massive tomb complex has remained sealed, protected by layers of earth, administrative bureaucracy, and increasingly sophisticated scientific evidence that suggests the burial chamber contains environmental hazards that could kill modern intruders as efficiently as they would have eliminated ancient grave robbers. Modern soil testing conducted by Chinese archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis reveals mercury contamination levels that are over 100 times normal background readings, concentrated in patterns that correspond exactly to ancient textual descriptions of the tomb's interior design. The contamination isn't random or naturally occurring. It follows geometric patterns that suggest deliberate, systematic distribution of liquid mercury throughout underground chambers designed to replicate the geography of the Chinese Empire in miniature. Ground-penetrating radar surveys reveal vast underground chambers extending dozens of meters in all directions from the burial vault, connected by corridors and passages that create a subterranean palace complex larger than many ancient cities. Within these chambers, electromagnetic anomalies suggest the presence of massive bronze installations, possibly the mechanical devices that Sima Qian described as creating artificial rivers and seas of flowing mercury. The official archaeological policy regarding the tomb: conservative and cautious. The burial chambers remain unopened due to legitimate conservation concerns and technological limitations. The Chinese government maintains that current excavation technology isn't sophisticated enough to preserve the tomb's contents if the sealed environment is disturbed. International archaeological organizations support this position, citing the catastrophic damage caused by premature excavation of other major ancient sites. But the mercury levels documented around the tomb perimeter suggest that conservation concerns may be secondary to safety issues that aren't being discussed publicly. The mercury isn't just decoration or symbolic representation. It's a lethal security system designed to kill intruders through vapor poisoning, a form of ancient chemical warfare that remains active after 23 centuries. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written approximately 1 century after the first emperor's death, provides technical details that read less like historical description and more like a forensic engineering report. Mercury was used to simulate the 100 rivers, the Yangtze and Yellow River, and the Great Sea, with machines making them flow and circulate. Above were representations of the heavenly constellations, below the features of the land. But Sima Qian also notes that, though, Crossbow traps were set to shoot any trespasser, and that the entire tomb complex was filled with mercury to prevent decay and kill tomb robbers. The engineering challenge involved in creating such a system would have required enormous quantities of mercury. Estimates suggest several tons of liquid metal distributed through a network of bronze channels designed to create continuous circulation patterns. The mercury would serve multiple functions: preservation of organic materials through antimicrobial properties, symbolic representation of water features for the emperor's afterlife empire, and automatic execution of unauthorized intruders through mercury vapor toxicity. Modern geochemical analysis confirms extraordinarily high mercury concentrations in soil samples taken from monitoring wells around the tomb perimeter. The concentrations are consistent with large-scale mercury deposits that would create toxic vapor clouds in confined underground spaces. Anyone entering the sealed chambers without sophisticated protective equipment would face mercury poisoning progression. Initial symptoms including tremors and coordination difficulties, followed by kidney failure, respiratory collapse, and death within hours or days depending on exposure levels. The genius of the system lies in its multiple layers of function and symbolism. The mercury simultaneously serves as preservation agent for the emperor's physical remains, cosmic symbolism that transforms the burial chamber into a miniature universe under imperial control, and automatic execution device that operates without requiring human guards or mechanical maintenance. The curse is encoded in environmental engineering rather than supernatural intervention, making it immune to religious change, cultural shifts, or political upheavals that might compromise other forms of tomb protection. Chinese historical texts from subsequent dynasties record multiple failed attempts to breach the tomb during periods of political instability, when imperial treasures were desperately needed to fund armies or buy political loyalty. Tang Dynasty court records describe excavation attempts that ended with workers falling sick and dying after minimal exposure to underground chambers. The symptoms described, tremors, confusion, respiratory distress, match modern medical understanding of mercury poisoning exactly. Qing Dynasty administrative documents mention poisonous vapors that killed several imperial treasure seekers who attempted to tunnel into the mausoleum during the late 18th century. The documents describe failed excavation attempts where workers reported seeing silver streams flowing in darkness and experiencing immediate illness upon exposure to underground air. Work was abandoned after multiple deaths, and the sites were sealed with additional earth to prevent further accidental exposure. Modern archaeological investigation teams working around the tomb perimeter report health incidents that correlate directly with proximity to areas of high mercury concentration. Persistent headaches that develop during extended field work, motor skill difficulties that affect equipment operation, memory problems that interfere with data recording. The Chinese government now requires comprehensive medical monitoring for all personnel working near the mausoleum, with regular blood tests to detect mercury exposure and strict rotation schedules to limit cumulative toxic effects. International teams seeking permission to conduct scientific surveys of the tomb area face extensive bureaucratic procedures that include medical clearances, insurance requirements that specifically cover mercury poisoning, and technical training in hazardous material handling protocols. These aren't routine archaeological safety measures. They're industrial hazmat procedures adapted for historical site investigation. You don't need ghosts if the tomb itself functions as a chemical weapon. The first emperor built his eternal resting place as a functional death trap that operates through environmental toxicity rather than supernatural intervention, proving that ancient engineering could create security systems as effective as any modern technology. Curse technology achieved through applied chemistry and environmental engineering rather than religious ritual. Modern museum visitors viewing artifacts from the tomb complex, bronze chariots, terracotta warriors, jade burial goods, unknowingly witness components of history's most sophisticated burial security system, a tomb designed to murder intruders automatically through coordinated toxic exposure, mechanical traps, and environmental hazards that would challenge modern special forces units equipped with protective gear. 23 centuries later, The mercury rivers still flow beneath the artificial mountain, creating toxic patterns that show up on satellite imagery and geochemical surveys. The tomb remains sealed not just by earth and stone, but by environmental conditions so hazardous that even modern technology can't safely breach them. The first emperor's paranoia created a security system that has outlasted every dynasty that followed him, proving that sometimes the most effective supernatural curses are the ones based on applied science and environmental engineering. Armies had their own version of this technological fear. Lose the sacred symbol, lose divine protection, lose everything that made victory possible. Legionary camp at dusk on the Germanic frontier. The Golden Eagle standard stands planted in the center of the camp, surrounded by torches that cast dancing shadows on polished metal. Soldiers swear oaths of loyalty not just to Rome, but to the spiritual power contained in the Aquila itself. Losing the eagle means more than military defeat. It means divine abandonment of the entire legion. Military historians describe legion standards as morale symbols and unit identification markers. Practical military equipment with psychological significance, but no supernatural properties. But Roman military dedications and oath formulas treat legion standards as divine objects, whose loss triggers automatic curse consequences for every soldier in the unit. The eagle wasn't just a symbol, it was a spiritual anchor that connected the legion to Roman divine authority. Dedication inscriptions from legion camps invoke Jupiter, Mars, and victory to protect this eagle and punish any who abandon or lose it. Soldiers swearing the military oath promised to defend the eagle with life and honor and accepted that loss of the eagle brings divine curse upon the legion and all its members. The most documented case, Legio 16 and 99, destroyed by Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE. All 3 eagles were captured, representing not just military defeat but spiritual catastrophe. Roman sources describe the disaster as divine punishment for military leadership failures that angered the gods of war. Marcus Caelius, a centurion who survived the massacre, returned to Rome and commissioned a funerary inscription for his missing brother that includes prayers for divine forgiveness, because the eagles were lost through no fault of his own. The inscription suggests that survivors of eagle loss faced spiritual contamination that required ritual purification. Emperor Tiberius spent decades organizing recovery missions to retrieve the lost Teutoburg eagles. This wasn't just military pride. Roman military theology required that captured eagles be recovered, or the associated curses would pursue the empire indefinitely. The eagles were eventually recovered through diplomacy and military pressure, followed by elaborate purification ceremonies to cleanse them of barbarian contamination. Legion curse tablets from frontier camps show soldiers performing protective rituals around the eagle standard, including blood offerings and oath renewals designed to strengthen divine protection. Some tablets call for divine punishment of soldiers who fail in courage before the eagle, or bring shame upon the standard through cowardice. Archaeological excavation of the Teutoburg battlefield in the 1990s uncovered Roman military equipment scattered across several square kilometers, but no eagles. The absence suggests that Germanic tribes understood the spiritual significance of the standards and either melted them down or preserved them as powerful trophies that carried Roman divine authority. Legion standards as spiritual anchors, military defeat as divine abandonment. Lost eagles as cursed objects that contaminate entire armies with divine displeasure. But some curses waited centuries before they were triggered. Line them up across your mind like pieces of a vast puzzle that finally clicks into place. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, Maya kingdoms, Inca Empire, medieval Armenia, Yoruba, sacred groves, Polynesian tapu systems, 30 civilizations spanning 5 continents and 4,000 years of human history, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, yet all using curses in exactly the same structural way, as alarm systems that protected sacred boundaries through supernatural surveillance, as legal contracts enforced by divine authority when human courts were unavailable or corrupt, as political propaganda that justified regime changes through claims of divine displeasure. as social control mechanisms that regulated behavior through fear of consequences that transcended earthly power structures. When those boundaries were broken, by locals who forgot their place, by conquerors who thought foreign gods were powerless, by archaeologists who believed ancient warnings were harmless superstition, what followed was always the same cluster of phenomena: sudden illness that doctors couldn't explain, accidents that defied probability, disasters that seemed targeted with supernatural precision, social and political chaos that spread like contagion through communities. Whether psychological, political, environmental, or something else entirely, the pattern repeats with mechanical consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other, across historical periods separated by millennia, across geographical regions that span the entire inhabited world. The pattern reveals its true nature. Ancient curses were never just about magic or supernatural intervention. They were about control, sophisticated, systematic control over human behavior through fear of consequences that operated independently of human authority. Control over valuable resources through spiritual enforcement mechanisms when physical enforcement was impossible across vast territories. Control over social order through divine authority that could not be corrupted, bribed, or overthrown by human ambition. Here's what makes them dangerous in any historical era, including our own. The belief in being cursed can alter choices, health outcomes, relationships, career decisions, entire life trajectories through psychological mechanisms that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. The curse works even without supernatural intervention because human psychology responds to perceived spiritual threat through real behavioral changes that produce observable consequences in the physical world. Consider the psychological mechanism in detail. If you believe that powerful ancient forces are pursuing you, your stress response system activates, flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline that compromise immune function and cognitive performance. You become hyper-aware of negative events while filtering out positive experiences, creating confirmation bias that makes coincidences seem like evidence of supernatural persecution. You make decisions based on fear rather than logic, isolating yourself from support systems that might protect you from both real and imagined threats. The curse becomes self-fulfilling through the victim's own responses to spiritual threat perception. Old stone church in the Armenian highlands. Morning light filters through mountain air as restoration workers approach medieval limestone walls covered with inscriptions that bridge ancient curse logic directly into Christian legal culture. These aren't random religious decorations. They're systematic supernatural property protection systems that demonstrate how curse technology adapted to survive religious transitions. Architectural interpretation, medieval Christian art, and religious memorial inscriptions. Devotional texts with spiritual significance for understanding Armenian ecclesiastical history. But these inscriptions name specific violators and call down detailed divine destruction on anyone stealing church property, using biblical language to deliver supernatural enforcement systems that echo ancient Near Eastern curse formulas. Medieval Christianity didn't replace ancient curse systems. It absorbed and adapted them. The monastery at Noravant contains inscription, Aarm. 39. 12. Carved during the 14th century. Whosoever shall seize the lands of this holy monastery, let him be struck with the leprosy of Naaman. Let his children perish like the sons of Eli. Let his name be blotted from the book of life. Let his body remain unburied for the fowls of heaven and the beasts of the earth to devour. The curse combines biblical precedents with traditional Armenian supernatural enforcement language, creating hybrid divine retaliation systems that operate through both Christian and traditional spiritual authority. The inscription functions as a supernatural property deed that enforces itself through divine violence against violations. More sophisticated, the church at Kor Virap contains escalating curse sequences that increase divine penalties over time. First-year violations bring illness to the violator. Third-year violations extend curses to family members. Seventh-year violations trigger complete lineage destruction. Progressive supernatural enforcement with specific timeline activation. Armenian legal documents from the medieval period reference church curse inscriptions as evidence in property disputes, suggesting that carved divine enforcement language had legal standing in ecclesiastical and secular courts. The curses weren't just spiritual threats, they were legally binding supernatural contracts. Archaeological surveys note unusual preservation patterns around Armenian churches with extensive curse inscriptions. These buildings suffered less earthquake damage and showed better long-term structural stability compared to contemporary churches without curse systems. Whether supernatural protection or increased community maintenance investment in protected buildings, the correlation suggests practical benefits from curse installation. Modern restoration projects require cultural consultation protocols due to worker reluctance to handle stones containing active curse inscriptions. The Armenian Patriarchate maintains traditional blessing procedures for construction teams to prevent spiritual complications during renovation work on medieval church sites. This demonstrates direct continuity from pharaohs to medieval priests, from ancient temples to Christian churches. Supernatural enforcement systems adapted and survived across religious transitions that supposedly replaced pagan practices with Christian alternatives. The technology evolved, but the core logic remained constant. Which brings us back to the original question. What are these really? Pacific shoreline. Sacred stones mark boundaries that separate ordinary space from spiritually dangerous areas, where ancient Polynesian tapu systems protect resources, burial grounds, and ritual sites through supernatural enforcement mechanisms that operate automatically against violators regardless of their knowledge or cultural background. Anthropological interpretation, traditional resource management, and cultural regulatory systems. Indigenous practices with historical significance for understanding Polynesian social organization. But tapu violation curses function as environmental spiritual law that operates through both supernatural and community enforcement mechanisms. Breaking tapu triggers coordinated responses that combine divine retaliation with immediate social and legal consequences administered by traditional authority systems. The tapu system creates graded spiritual protection around specific locations, objects, and activities. Violation consequences escalate from minor, supernatural warning signs to complete spiritual and social destruction, depending on the severity and persistence of the violation. The curse system operates through environmental monitoring, where spiritual authorities track violation indicators and respond with appropriate escalation. Breaking tapu around sacred fishing grounds triggers supernatural consequences that manifest as ecological retaliation. Fish disappear from traditional grounds, equipment fails systematically, weather patterns shift to prevent successful fishing. Whether ecological or spiritual, the effects force violators to respect traditional resource management boundaries. Captain James Cook's Pacific Voyage journals document tapu violation incidents where European crew members experienced sudden illness or accidents after handling sacred objects or entering prohibited areas without permission. Local authorities consistently predicted specific misfortunes for specific crew members based on the type and severity of their tapu violations. More documented, the 1820s missionary period in Hawaii. Christian missionaries attempting to suppress traditional spiritual practices experienced systematic difficulties that indigenous communities interpreted as automatic tapu enforcement. Missionary journals record equipment failures, illness patterns, and social conflicts that correlated with their interference in traditional sacred sites. Reverend William Ellis's journal describes attempts to remove sacred stones from a traditional Heiau temple site. Our native workers fled after the first stones were disturbed, claiming that breaking the tapu would bring disaster upon all involved. Within days, several of our mission workers fell ill with fever, our printing equipment failed, and local communities withdrew their support for our activities. The genius of the tapu system. It operated through integrated community and supernatural enforcement, where social consequences and spiritual consequences reinforced each other. Violating spiritual law triggered immediate social ostracism, which felt like curse activation to violators who found themselves suddenly isolated from community support systems. Contemporary Pacific environmental management incorporates traditional tapu protocols in marine protected areas, and cultural preservation zones. Modern conservation efforts recognize that traditional spiritual enforcement systems provide more effective resource protection than conventional legal regulations in indigenous communities. Curses embedded in social code where law and supernatural enforcement merge into unified community policing. Spiritual boundary maintenance through coordinated divine and social retaliation systems that protect cultural and environmental resources. Kyoto Palace at night. Court lamps flicker in corridors where aristocrats move like shadows, whispering about vengeful spirits that manifest as political disasters. In Heian, Japan, wronged nobility became supernatural weapons after death, their curses operating through imperial bureaucracy to pursue enemies who had destroyed them during life. Academic interpretation, folk belief, and cultural mythology. Religious traditions that influenced classical Japanese literature but had no practical political significance. But Heian court diaries document systematic government responses to Onryo attacks. Official exorcisms, ministerial appointments made to appease specific spirits, and policy changes implemented to satisfy posthumous supernatural demands. Ghostly revenge wasn't folklore, it was documented political process. The Onryo system operated through the principle that powerful individuals who died in disgrace retained spiritual authority that could manifest as coordinated disasters affecting their enemies. Wronged courtiers, executed officials, and exiled aristocrats became posthumous political actors whose supernatural influence required ongoing government management. The most documented case, Sugawara no Michizane, exiled from court in 901 CE after political persecution by the Fujiwara clan. After his death in exile, Kyoto experienced a series of disasters that court officials attributed to Michizane's vengeful spirit. Lightning strikes killed several Fujiwara family members, plague devastated the capital, and political chaos disrupted imperial succession. Court records document systematic attempts to appease Michizane's Onryo through escalating concessions, restoration of his court rank, official apologies for his exile, construction of Kitano Shrine to honor his spirit, and eventually deification as Tenjin, god of scholarship. The ghost effectively won his political battle through supernatural warfare that forced the government to rehabilitate his reputation posthumously. The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon records routine court procedures for managing Onryo threats, divination to identify which spirit was causing current disasters, consultation with religious authorities to determine appropriate appeasement rituals, and bureaucratic negotiations with spiritual mediators who could communicate government offers to angry ghosts. More systematic, Heian government records show that ministerial appointments and policy decisions were regularly influenced by Onryo considerations. Officials avoided positions or policies that might provoke known vengeful spirits. Court ceremonies included routine offerings to deceased political figures who might otherwise return as the supernatural prosecutors. The system provided posthumous legal recourse for political victims who had been destroyed through court intrigue during their lifetimes. Death enhanced rather than ended their political influence, creating supernatural accountability mechanisms that operated outside conventional legal channels. Modern Japanese government offices in former Heian territories maintain discreet consultation relationships with traditional spiritual practitioners who understand historical Onryo obligations. Administrative difficulties in certain Kyoto government buildings are routinely attributed to cultural sensitivity issues requiring traditional resolution methods. Wronged elites to posthumous spiritual weapons. Government-level rituals to appease supernatural political actors. Death as enhancement of, rather than end to political authority, through spiritual prosecution systems. Wind sweeps across empty Icelandic fields where nothing grows. Here, medieval Icelanders raise nidstung, curse poles carved with runic inscriptions and topped with horse skulls or carved faces, to focus supernatural attack against specific enemies. The poles stood until they rotted or until the target was destroyed, whichever came first. Academic interpretation, Norse religious practice, and cultural expression of social conflict. Folkloric traditions with historical significance for understanding medieval Icelandic society. But Icelandic saga literature and legal codes treat Nidstong as functional supernatural weapons with real legal consequences. Raising a curse pole wasn't symbolic expression. It was spiritual assault that could trigger both magical retaliation and legal prosecution. The process required specific materials and ritual knowledge. Horse skulls provided spiritual focus for the curse because horses were sacred to Odin, god of death and war. Runic inscriptions specified the target's name, the desired punishment, and appeals to specific gods for enforcement. The pole was raised on the target's property boundary or in a location where the target would be forced to see it regularly. Egil's saga describes the most detailed Nidstong procedure. Egil Skallagrimsson raises a curse pole against King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, carving runic inscriptions that call upon Landvetter, land spirits, to drive them from Norway and give them no rest until they are exiled. The saga reports that the royal couple was forced into exile shortly after the curse pole was raised. The legal aspect. Icelandic law codes specified fines and penalties for raising Nidstong without justification, suggesting that curse poles were regulated magical practice rather than random religious expression. The Graga's law code lists Nidstong among full outlawry offenses if used without proper legal grounds, indicating that supernatural attack had standing in medieval Icelandic courts. More sophisticated, some Nidstong installations included time-release curse mechanisms. The pole would be constructed with multiple phases of runic inscription that activated sequentially over months or years, creating escalating supernatural pressure against the target until they complied with the curse raiser's demands or suffered complete social destruction. Archaeological excavations in Iceland occasionally uncover medieval post holes with unusual characteristics, soil contamination, electromagnetic anomalies, and what site reports describe as persistent technical difficulties with surveying equipment. Local contractors familiar with saga literature recognize these as potential Nidstong sites and require special consultation before construction projects. The curse pole system provided legal supernatural warfare for disputes that couldn't be resolved through conventional courts. Property conflicts, inheritance disputes, and personal vendettas could be prosecuted through ritual magical attack that operated within established legal frameworks. Curse as public humiliation instrument, supernatural violence regulated by law codes and community standards. Medieval magical practice integrated into legal system as alternative dispute resolution mechanism. Volcanic ash preserves a moment frozen in time. A Roman house where the floor mosaic shows a massive eye surrounded by symbols of protection and violence. Phallic charms hang from door frames. Latin inscriptions warn against envy and intrusion. This isn't just home decoration. It's a domestic curse system where ordinary Romans turned their houses into micro-temples of supernatural protection. Art historical interpretation, apotropaic symbolism, and popular religious art. Decorative elements reflecting ancient Mediterranean beliefs about protection from misfortune. But the House of the Evil Eye represents systematic domestic cursing, where middle-class Romans invested significant resources in supernatural home security systems. These weren't random good luck charms. They were coordinated magical installations designed to function as household-level divine enforcement. The floor mosaic depicts a massive eye pierced by arrows, bitten by serpents, attacked by scorpions, and trampled by lions. Surrounding Latin inscription reads, "Here dwells happiness, evil eye beware, good fortune enters, evil departs." The imagery creates a visual curse trap, where anyone entering with malicious intentions faces immediate supernatural retaliation. Room-by-room analysis reveals strategic curse placement throughout the house. Door frames contain phallic amulets positioned to strike anyone entering with harmful intent. Window ledges hold bronze protective figures that guard against spiritual attack. Even kitchen areas include curse symbols designed to protect food and family from supernatural contamination. The domestic curse system operated through accumulated protective symbols that created overlapping fields of supernatural security. Roman religious practice encouraged homeowners to build multi-layered divine protection systems that could automatically detect and neutralize spiritual threats without requiring conscious activation by the inhabitants. Archaeological notes from early Pompeii excavations record unusual incidents in houses with extensive curse installations. Workers reported equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and what site logs describe as persistent unease, while excavating homes with heavy concentrations of protective curse symbols. More systematic. Excavation records show that houses with elaborate curse installations suffered less structural damage from the volcanic eruption. Whether due to superior construction quality or supernatural protection, homes with extensive evil eye defenses show better preservation than comparable houses without curse systems. The curse logic extended to commercial activity. Shop signs from Pompeii include systematic curse language targeting competitors. May Venus make my rival's customers desert him. Let Mercury confuse the accounts of anyone who undercuts my prices. May Fortuna cause my competitor's merchandise to spoil in his warehouse. Modern conservation efforts at Pompeii require special handling protocols for buildings with curse installations. Site reports document elevated accident rates among restoration teams working on houses with extensive protective symbols. The site administration requires briefings on cultural sensitivity for workers handling curse-related artifacts. Domestic curse system, home as micro-temple of protection. Suburban supernatural security that operated through consumer religious products, marketed to middle-class Romans seeking divine home protection. Ancient stone church in the Armenian highlands. Moss grows over limestone walls carved with inscriptions that look decorative from a distance, but reveal themselves as detailed supernatural legal contracts when examined closely. These aren't religious ornaments, they're medieval divine enforcement systems that bridge ancient curse logic directly into Christian legal culture. Standard architectural interpretation, devotional inscriptions, and memorial dedications. Religious art with spiritual significance for medieval Armenian Christian communities. But Armenian church curse inscriptions name specific violators and call down systematic divine destruction on anyone stealing church land, with detailed multi-part punishments that echo ancient Near Eastern curse formulas. Medieval Christianity inherited and adapted older supernatural enforcement systems rather than replacing them. The Church of the Holy Cross at Agtamar contains inscription KHB 847, which calls divine vengeance on Gajik Artsruni for seizing monastery property. May the Lord God strike him with leprosy. May his children die before him. May his name be forgotten among the living. May his body remain unburied for the birds to devour. The inscription lists 17 specific curses drawn from biblical precedent, but organized according to ancient Armenian legal curse formulas. These weren't emotional religious expressions. They were legal documents carved in stone, designed to operate indefinitely as supernatural property protection. Armenian legal texts from the same period reference church curse inscriptions as evidence in property disputes, suggesting that divine enforcement language had standing in secular courts, more complex. Some Armenian church curses include escalation clauses that increase supernatural penalties over time. The monastery at Sanahin contains curse inscriptions that specify graduated divine punishments. First year of violation brings illness, third year brings family disasters, seventh year brings complete lineage destruction. Perpetual legal enforcement through accumulated supernatural penalties. The inscriptions bridge pagan and Christian supernatural systems by invoking both biblical divine authority and traditional Armenian spiritual enforcement mechanisms. Saint Grigor and the Virgin Mary are called upon to work alongside traditional Armenian protective spirits in coordinated supernatural retaliation against violators. Archaeological surveys of medieval Armenian church sites note unusual preservation patterns around buildings with extensive curse inscriptions. These structures show less damage from earthquakes, invasions, and natural weathering compared to non-cursed contemporary buildings. Whether supernatural or social, communities investing more maintenance in protected buildings. The correlation suggests that curse systems provided practical preservation benefits. Modern restoration projects at Armenian churches require cultural consultation. Protocols due to worker reluctance to handle stones containing curse inscriptions. The Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople maintains traditional blessing procedures for construction teams working on medieval church sites to prevent spiritual difficulties during renovation. This bridges ancient curse logic directly into medieval Christian legal culture, from pharaohs to priests, from temples to churches, shows continuity of supernatural enforcement systems across religious transitions that supposedly replaced pagan practices with Christian alternatives. Which brings us back to the question we started with. What are these really? Superstitions? Or the skeleton of something much bigger? Dense forest in southwestern Nigeria. Ancient Iroko trees tower overhead, their massive trunks wrapped with white cloth offerings. Carved shrines nest among root systems that have grown over stone foundations for centuries. This is a sacred grove where Yoruba spiritual law enforcement operates through environmental integration. The forest itself serves as a living curse system that protects religious boundaries through ecological supernatural punishment, anthropological classification, traditional religious practices, and cultural landscape management. Indigenous spiritual systems with historical significance for understanding West African societies. But Yoruba sacred groves function as supernatural legal jurisdictions, where violations against spiritual law trigger immediate environmental retaliation. These aren't symbolic sacred spaces. They're operational supernatural enforcement zones where divine authority operates through direct ecological intervention. The grove system operates through Asi, divine life force that flows through specific landscapes designated by the Orisha as enforcement territories. Entering protected groves without proper spiritual preparation, cutting sacred trees, or disturbing shrine areas triggers immediate AC retaliation that manifests as illness, accidents, or social disasters for violators and their families. Colonial British administrative records from 1920s Nigeria document multiple incidents where forestry officials attempting to survey sacred groves experienced what department reports describe as unusual setbacks, surveying equipment failures, severe illness among workers, and what one report calls persistent local opposition backed by apparent natural phenomena. District Officer H.E. Crouch's 1923 report from Abeokuta describes an attempt to map the Olumo Sacred Grove. Our surveying team experienced immediate difficulties upon entering the protected area. Equipment compass needles spun wildly, measuring chains broke repeatedly, and 3 workers developed severe fevers that local medical officer could not diagnose. Work was suspended after local priests explained that grove violations required specific ritual remediation. More documented, the 1934 incident at Osun Sacred Grove near Osogbo. A British timber company attempted to harvest sacred Iroko trees without community consent. Within 1 week, the company's sawmill machinery suffered complete mechanical failure. The site foreman died from sudden illness, and abnormal flooding destroyed access roads to the grove. Work was abandoned permanently. Yoruba priests maintain that sacred grove penalties operate through ecological spiritual networks where trees, water sources, and animal communities serve as enforcement agents for violated spiritual law. Cutting a sacred tree doesn't just anger the Orisha, it disrupts A's flow patterns that regulate environmental balance, triggering ecological retaliation against the violation. Contemporary conservation efforts around Yoruba sacred groves require ongoing consultation with traditional spiritual authorities who understand which areas function as active supernatural enforcement zones. The Nigerian National Park Service includes traditional blessing ceremonies in grove management protocols due to documented difficulties with conservation projects that ignore indigenous spiritual law. Groves as spaces where law, religion, and ecology merge under divine threat. Environmental spiritual enforcement operating through integrated landscape management systems that protect sacred boundaries through coordinated supernatural and natural retaliation. From scrolls to swamps, from mountains to groves, the message was the same. Cross the line, and someone will come for you. But the final pieces of this pattern are the ones that sit closest to us in time. High Andes, elevation 12,000 feet, where the air is thin enough to make lowlanders dizzy and the cold cuts through wool and leather like a blade forged from winter itself. Spanish conquistadors, their steel armor gleaming incongruously against the stark beauty of mountain peaks that seem to scrape the belly of heaven, pry open stone shrines with iron crowbars, their movements clumsy and labored in the oxygen-starved atmosphere. Their breath forms clouds in the bitter mountain air as they work, each exhalation a visible reminder that they're operating in an environment that wasn't designed for European physiology. Behind them, indigenous chroniclers and surviving Inca nobility watch in horrified silence as foreign hands that have never learned the proper ritual purification protocols, hands that carry the spiritual contamination of conquistador violence, touch sacred bundles containing mummified ancestors whose preservation rituals have maintained their spiritual presence for centuries. This violation that ancient Andean theology declares will trigger devastating spiritual retaliation, not just against the individual violators, but against anyone who assists them, benefits from their actions, or fails to prevent their sacrilege. The ancestors aren't just preserved bodies, they're active spiritual authorities whose protection systems have been carefully maintained through generations of ritual specialists who understood the technological requirements for keeping the dead politically and magically active. Colonial Spanish records, maintained with the bureaucratic obsessiveness that characterized imperial administration throughout the Americas, classify indigenous reactions to shrine desecration as heathen superstition and primitive fear of the dead. Religious ignorance that proper Christian education and systematic cultural suppression would eventually overcome. Colonial administrators, trained in European legal traditions and Catholic theology, had no conceptual framework for understanding indigenous spiritual technology that integrated ancestor worship with political authority and environmental management. But Spanish colonial documents preserved in archives in Seville, Lima, and Cusco record systematic illness and disaster patterns among conquistadors and clergy directly involved in shrine desecration that defy explanation through conventional European medical understanding or climatic adaptation theories. What colonial administrators dismissed as unfortunate coincidence, indigenous communities interpreted as predictable spiritual enforcement of ancient protective systems that operated independently of human belief or cultural background. The sacred bundle, Capacocha system that had protected mummified ancestors for centuries before European contact represented one of the most sophisticated curse technologies ever developed, integrating ancestor worship, political authority, environmental management, and supernatural enforcement into unified protective protocols. Disturbing these bundles without proper ritual preparation triggered what Andean theology systematically categorized as ancestral anger, coordinated supernatural retaliation that could pursue violators indefinitely across geographical boundaries and cultural transitions. Indigenous preservation technology maintained ancestor mummies through environmental controls, chemical treatments, and ritual procedures that kept the bodies physically intact while preserving their spiritual authority within community social structures. The mummies weren't just preserved corpses. They were active political entities whose opinions were consulted on important decisions, whose property rights were maintained through legal procedures, and whose supernatural authority was regularly renewed through ceremonial observances that treated them as living community members. Fray Bernabé Cobo's Comprehensive History of the New World, 1653, compiled from decades of colonial experience and indigenous informant testimonies, documents multiple cases where Spanish treasure seekers died or suffered catastrophic misfortune after robbing indigenous shrines containing ancestor mummies. Cobo, a Jesuit priest with extensive theological education and medical training, attributed these incidents to divine justice operating through natural means, but noted that indigenous communities consistently predicted specific misfortunes for specific violators with accuracy rates that he found disturbing to Christian understanding. Pedro Pizarro's first-hand chronicle of the conquest period describes the immediate aftermath of opening royal mummy bundles at Cusco, with clinical precision that reads like a medical case study. Many of our men fell sick with fevers and bleeding sickness that our surgeons could not treat, and some died raving about phantoms of dead kings pursuing them through their dreams. The Indian priests said this would continue until the mummies were properly honored according to their ancient customs. but our chaplains forbade any participation in heathen rituals. The most thoroughly documented case involves Captain Diego de Almagro's expedition to Chile, 1535-37, an ambitious military venture that represented one of the largest and best-equipped Spanish exploration forces assembled during the early conquest period. After systematically looting multiple Inca shrines containing royal mummies, treating them as sources of gold and silver rather than sacred political entities, the expedition experienced losses that approached catastrophic proportions. Extreme weather patterns that trapped the force in mountain passes for months. Indigenous attacks coordinated across tribal boundaries that had never previously cooperated. Starvation that reduced a well-supplied army to cannibalism. And disease outbreaks that killed over 2/3 of the Spanish participants. Almagro himself died shortly after returning to Peru, officially assassinated by political rivals, but showing symptoms that indigenous witnesses attributed to ancestral curse sickness, progressive weakness, disorientation, and what Spanish medical records describe as melancholic madness characterized by hallucinations of dead Inca rulers. Colonial medical understanding couldn't explain the symptom patterns, but indigenous healers had detailed diagnostic procedures for identifying and treating various categories of ancestral curse afflictions. Indigenous chroniclers like Felipe Guaman Poma, whose massive illustrated manuscript, New Chronicle and Good Government, preserves detailed information about pre-conquest Andean political and religious systems, documented the curse technology with systematic precision that reads like a technical manual. Violations against ancestor mummies triggered coordinated spiritual attacks that could manifest through multiple channels, natural disasters that destroyed agricultural systems and transportation infrastructure, military defeats that scattered Spanish forces and destroyed their indigenous alliances, disease epidemics that targeted specific individuals or groups, and political collapse that eliminated the violators' authority and social networks. The curse systems targeted not just individual violators, but entire social networks that benefited from shrine desecration, creating expanding circles of supernatural liability that could affect Spanish colonial administrators, indigenous collaborators, and even European merchants who purchased stolen sacred objects for shipment to private collections in Spain. The ancestors apparently understood economic chains of complicity and pursued spiritual justice through whatever channels were necessary to reach the ultimate beneficiaries of their desecration. Modern archaeological investigations of Inca burial sites throughout the Andean region require extensive consultation with indigenous spiritual authorities who maintain traditional protocols for approaching ancestor mummies without triggering defensive spiritual responses. The Peruvian government, responding to decades of conflicts between scientific research teams and indigenous communities, now mandates comprehensive cultural sensitivity procedures for high-altitude archaeological work, including ritual permissions from traditional spiritual specialists who understand the technical requirements for safely interacting with preserved ancestors. International museums holding Inca mummy collections report persistent conservation challenges that correlate directly with the spiritual status of their holdings within indigenous belief systems. Climate control failures, security system malfunctions, and unexplained deterioration of preservation materials occur at statistically significant rates in collections containing ancestor mummies that were removed from Peru without proper spiritual permissions. Conservation staff require specialized training in cultural protocols that acknowledge the ongoing spiritual authority of preserved indigenous ancestors. Curses functioned as sophisticated defense mechanisms against imperial theft, representing indigenous technologies for protecting ancestral authority and community resources from foreign interference. The spiritual enforcement systems operated through indigenous belief networks that remained active even under colonial suppression, creating persistent accountability mechanisms that pursued violators through multiple generations until appropriate restitution was made or traditional spiritual procedures were completed. And far to the west, across the Pacific Ocean, where different ancestors watched over different sacred landscapes, entire forests were transformed into living, breathing warnings that integrated environmental protection with spiritual enforcement through ecological systems that made the landscape itself a participant in supernatural law enforcement. Jungle canopy filters sunlight into green-tinted beams as archaeological teams hack through undergrowth toward limestone structures abandoned for a millennium. Vines wrap around carved stelae that emerge from root systems like ancient bones. When the vegetation is cleared, Maya hieroglyphs become visible, including systematic death warnings that document the spiritual consequences of political violations in city-states across the P10. Standard archaeological interpretation, ceremonial inscriptions, and political propaganda. Religious symbolism used to legitimize royal authority during classic period Maya civilization. But recent decipherment reveals that Maya death glyphs functioned as legal curse formulas with precise enforcement specifications. These aren't symbolic threats. They're documented supernatural enforcement policies that operated across Maya political networks. Stela 31 from Tikal contains death glyph sequences targeting anyone who breaks the sacred count or violates the lordship of Jasaw Chan Ka'awil. The inscription specifies that violators will face dissolution of the life force, separation from the ancestors, and wandering in darkness without rest. Maya afterlife theology made these punishments equivalent to complete spiritual annihilation. The complexity of Maya curse glyphs required a professional scribal class that understood both political law and supernatural enforcement protocols. Death warnings weren't decorative elements added to political inscriptions. They were core components of Maya legal documents that specified exact spiritual penalties for specific violations. Kopan Stela A contains a multi-ruler curse system where violations against any member of a political alliance trigger coordinated supernatural retaliation from all allied kingdoms' patron deities. The inscription creates a mutual spiritual defense treaty backed by divine enforcement across territorial boundaries. Archaeological evidence suggests that Maya curse glyphs were linked to actual political collapse events. Piedras Negras, which commissioned extensive death warning inscriptions during the late 8th century CE, was abandoned permanently around 810 CE, after what hieroglyphic records describe as divine anger at the royal house. More systematic. Cities that invested heavily in curse glyph production during the terminal classic period consistently experienced political collapse within 50 years of their final curse inscriptions. The correlation suggests either supernatural causation or psychological effects where rulers obsessed with curse protection lost focus on practical governance. We had to reconstruct an entire writing system to read some of these warnings. And what they say is not subtle. Maya scribes used over 40 different hieroglyphic combinations to specify varieties of spiritual death, from temporary ancestral separation to permanent cosmic exile. The curse vocabulary was more sophisticated than the trade vocabulary. Modern epigraphers working on Maya death glyph projects report unusual research difficulties, funding delays, institutional obstacles, computer failures that specifically target curse-related databases. The Maya hieroglyphic database at the University of Texas requires daily backup procedures due to persistent technical problems affecting curse glyph entries. And just like in the old world, the dead themselves were drafted into enforcement. 3 gold tablets shimmer under museum lighting, their surfaces covered with inscriptions in both Etruscan and Phoenician. Discovered in 1964 at the Sanctuary of Pergi, these aren't just bilingual diplomatic records. They are multilingual curse systems designed to enforce temple regulations through coordinated supernatural violence involving multiple pantheons. Standard academic interpretation, religious dedication, and bilingual diplomatic inscription. Important historical evidence for Etruscan-Phoenician cultural exchange during the 5th century BCE. But the tablets contain systematic curse language targeting anyone who violates temple property, with enforcement protocols that invoke both Etruscan and Phoenician deities working in supernatural coordination. This isn't cultural exchange, it's international curse cooperation. The Etruscan text calls on Uni, Hera, to destroy the violator's house and scatter his possessions, while the Phoenician version invokes Astarte to bring plague upon his family and curse his descendants. The bilingual format ensures that divine enforcement operates regardless of the violator's cultural background. Etruscan gods pursue Etruscan violators, Phoenician gods pursue Phoenician violators. Pyrgi functioned as an international trading port where merchants from across the Mediterranean conducted business under the protection of multiple religious systems. The gold tablets established supernatural law enforcement that transcended political boundaries, creating a divine security system for temple commerce. The curse clauses specify economic penalties. Let his ships sink in the harbor. Let his cargo rot in the warehouses. Let his trading partners abandon him. Let his credit fail throughout the ports of the sea. These aren't metaphysical threats. They're targeted disruptions of specific business activities that would bankrupt a merchant completely. Etruscan legal papyri from the same period reference the Pyrgi tablets as precedent for divine contract enforcement in commercial disputes. Merchants who violated temple agreements could face coordinated supernatural and legal prosecution, with the bilingual curses serving as evidence in both Etruscan and Phoenician courts. Archaeological excavation records from the Pyrgi sanctuary note that the gold tablets were discovered in a sealed deposit alongside ritual objects used for curse activation. Lead figurines, pierced bronze sheets, and clay vessels containing what chemical analysis identified as human blood mixed with wine and aromatic substances. The discovery team experienced what the site report describes as persistent logistical difficulties during excavation of the tablet deposit. Equipment theft, permit delays, worker illnesses, and funding shortfalls forced the excavation to extend across 3 seasons instead of the planned single summer campaign. International curse cooperation, fusion of state cult, politics, and sacred threat. Gold tablets as proof that ancient Mediterranean communities created integrated supernatural enforcement systems that operated across cultural boundaries. Modern museum visitors viewing the Pyrgi tablets unknowingly witness components of history's earliest documented multicultural legal system, divine law enforcement, that functioned regardless of the violator's ethnicity, citizenship, or religious background. Across the ocean, another civilization carved their curses into stone, and their writing system nearly vanished with them. Lindo Moss, Cheshire, peat cutters sliced through layers of compressed organic matter with mechanical precision, excavating commercial fuel from ancient wetlands. The cutting machine strikes something that isn't peat, human flesh preserved in the bog's anaerobic chemistry for over 2,000 years. What emerges looks like a recent murder victim, skin intact, facial features clear, violent death obvious. Archaeological classification, ritual sacrifice, and Iron Age burial practice. Ancient religious ceremonies with historical significance for understanding Celtic societies. But bog body excavations consistently produce what excavation reports euphemistically call technical difficulties. Equipment failures, worker injuries, project delays that correlate with proximity to bog burials. The pattern suggests that whatever spiritual protocols protected these sacrifices may still function across millennia. Lindo Man was discovered in 1984 during commercial peat cutting. The body showed evidence of ritual execution, garrote strangulation, skull fracture, throat cutting, naked burial in sacred wetland. Carbon dating placed death around 50 CE, during the period when Roman forces were suppressing Druidic religious practices in Britain. Excavation records document unusual incidents throughout the recovery process. The peat cutting machine suffered hydraulic failure immediately after contact with the body. 3 workers were hospitalized for injuries during the extraction. The archaeology team's Land Rover crashed on the site access road. Local contractor Tony Johnson developed severe dermatitis after handling preservation containers and was unable to return to work for 6 weeks. More systematic, bog body excavations across northern Europe show similar incident patterns. Tolland Mon in Denmark, 1950. The excavation team experienced multiple equipment failures and 2 worker hospitalizations. Graubal Mon, 1952. The archaeological team leader suffered a heart attack during excavation. Clonycaven Man in Ireland, 2003. The discovery team's vehicles experienced simultaneous electrical failures in the bog area. Celtic religious practices associated wetlands with divine threshold spaces where sacrificial offerings maintained cosmic order. Disturbing bog sacrifices without proper spiritual protocol violated ancient agreements between human communities and supernatural forces that controlled agricultural fertility, tribal warfare, and seasonal transitions. Archaeological interpretation suggests bog bodies were executed during periods of crisis, harvest failure, plague, military threat, as offerings to wetland deities. The victims may have been high-status individuals whose deaths purchased divine intervention for their communities. Disturbing such sacrifices could reactivate the original crisis conditions. Modern peat-cutting operations in bog body areas require cultural sensitivity protocols that include notification of local archaeological authorities, consultation with indigenous spiritual practitioners, and what company manuals describe as appropriate respect for ancient burial practices. Insurance companies require additional coverage for bog cutting operations due to documented elevated accident rates. The bodies aren't just archaeological specimens, they're preserved sacrificial contracts between ancient communities and supernatural forces, agreements that apparently remain active until properly concluded. Through spiritual protocols, the modern world has largely forgotten. Landscape as long-term curse container. Wetland sacrifices as time-delayed supernatural agreements. Ancient religious contracts awaiting closure. In other places, the warnings were written in gold. Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Inside the Guri Amir Mausoleum, jade tombstone of Timur, Tamerlane, bears an inscription in Persian that promises supernatural retaliation against anyone who disturbs the conqueror's rest. When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble. Soviet archaeological policy treated such inscriptions as medieval superstition, historical curiosities with no contemporary relevance. But on June 20th, 1941, Soviet scientists opened Tamerlane's tomb as part of a state-sponsored archaeological expedition. 2 days later, on June 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Nazi forces struck across a 2,000-kilometer front, beginning the deadliest conflict in Soviet experience. The timing was noticed immediately. Local Islamic scholars in Samarkand interpreted the German invasion as direct fulfillment of Tamerlane's warning. Russian Orthodox clergy privately noted the correlation in church records. Even Communist Party officials documented the chronological coincidence in internal reports, though publicly they dismissed any supernatural connection. Garegin Sahakyan, the Soviet anthropologist who examined Tamerlane's remains, reported severe personal difficulties that began immediately after the excavation. His wife died in a car accident, his son was killed at the Stalingrad front, his academic career was destroyed by political persecution. In private letters, Sahakyan admitted he had begun to take the warning seriously. The tomb inscription includes secondary curses. Whosoever opens my tomb shall release an invader more terrible than I. Tamerlane's conquests killed an estimated 17 million people across Central Asia, Persia, and India. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union killed over 27 million Soviet citizens. The arithmetic suggests disturbing precision in the curse prediction. More unsettling. Soviet military performance improved dramatically after Tamerlane's remains were reinterred with full Islamic honors in November 1942. The ceremony coincided with the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, which marked the turning point of the Eastern Front. Stalin personally authorized the Islamic burial rites despite official state atheism. Modern Uzbek historians maintain detailed records of foreign archaeological teams seeking access to Tamerlane's tomb. Multiple Western expeditions have been denied permits, officially due to conservation concerns, but local administrators privately cite cultural sensitivity regarding disturbance of the burial. The mausoleum's current curator, Davron Rahimov, reports that maintenance workers regularly experience unusual incidents while working in the burial chamber. Equipment failures, sudden illness, accidents that happen only when working too close to the inscription. The facility's maintenance schedule now includes Islamic protective prayers before any work involving the tombstone. Modern curse case study mirroring ancient logic. Medieval warning system apparently activated by 20th century archaeological intrusion. Correlation between tomb violation and immediate historical catastrophe. observed and documented by multiple witnesses across political and religious boundaries. And then there are the sacrifices that were never meant to be touched again.